So hello everyone and welcome to our week 3 roundup. I'm Gillian and this is Kim. You've met us throughout the course on the films and you've met us, I hope, on the comments boards too. We've really enjoyed reading your responses to the course material that we've put together. So this is the week 3 roundup, but it's the end of the course too. So Kim and I thought we'd use it as an opportunity to review the whole course in a way, and to talk about some of these myths that we've wanted to challenge with the course materials. Myths about Jane Austen, things we think are true, but actually upon investigation turn out not to be quite so true. So we've got our first myth, and I'm going to ask Kim to respond to this one, and we'll try and keep it as a conversation. Of course, you can join in the comments too. Jane Austen was writing at a time when women were not allowed to write, and she published anonymously as a lady because of this sort of expectation that women didn't write.
Well, I think this is something that's kind of come up sort of fairly repeatedly actually on this run and the last run too. And actually Austen is writing within a quite long tradition of women writers who did publish under their own name, who wrote extensively and who sometimes used their own name in a really canny way. So one of the writers that I look at is Eliza Haywood, who became very good at using her name as a kind of brand to suggest a certain type of fiction. So there are a number of different women that Jane Austen is drawing on as well from her own time period. People like Mary Wollstonecraft, people like Frances Burney, Maria Edgeworth, and then earlier than that in the mid-century as well, people like Charlotte Lennox. We've mentioned the female Quixote a few times as something that Austen perhaps read. Is one of my favourites, that novel. I think this idea of women writers as kind of being sort of retiring as well and not willing to really speak about politics is something that's also kind of threaded into this myth. So I've been reading the comments on Mansfield Park today, and this kind of question of whether or not Austen was actually engaging with questions about slavery in her day. And I think Austen might be doing that quite covertly, but she is again working within a tradition of women writers who were very explicitly responding to political events of the time. So Wollstonecraft is writing about the French Revolution.
Charlotte Smith who Jane Austen must have read, is very much doing this in response to the French Revolution.
So I think there's this history of women engaging directly in politics, but also indirectly by thinking about the position of women, which is something that Austen herself does, something that Haywood did as well. So in writing these kind of romance stories, she's still thinking about ways that women have power or agency, and the Gothic does that as well. It thinks about how women are displaced or victimised. So to kind of round that up then, I think Austen is actually writing within a very long tradition of women writers who write under their own name and who are very assured in their engagement with politics. I wonder whether you could say something about why she publishes as a lady, because I don't think it's from sheer embarrassment, really.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think again that can often be a brand. Most people in the 18th century, although their authorship was known, and this is men as well as women, they actually published anonymously. I mean, Samuel Richardson, very famously, his name never appeared on any of his publications. A lady is a brand, and bibliographical research on novels of the Romantic period have identified some of these ladies who were in fact men. There were preconceptions that this kind of novel would be destined for a female readership. So if a lady wrote it, it's a comment about class, it's a comment about respectability and appropriate reading material for your mothers and daughters.
And actually I think by the end of the 18th century, I know that most of the novels published were still anonymous, but there were more named women than there were named men publishing at that.
Absolutely, and important brands like Burney, like Edgeworth, etc., etc. So there's a lot to talk about here. I suppose we could give you some suggestions for further reading women writing like Austen in Austen's age, who were not Austen. I'm going to vote for Charlotte Smith's Desmond, a very political novel.
I think probably Maria Edgeworth, actually. I think whenever I read Edgeworth, she seems to have that kind of comedic edge in some ways.
Castle Rackrent would be a good
yeah.
place to start,
Yeah,
and Belinda
absolutely.
would be a good place to follow up.
Absolutely.
So myth 2.
Yes, myth 2, Jane Austen was not read in her own lifetime, and her popularity was something that came much later. So I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, so, well, the great thing about this course is we've been introducing you to some free online resources where you can investigate that myth for yourself. So in week 1, we had you looking at the Cardiff database of production and reception, which enabled you to read reviews of Austen's fiction. And what I've really enjoyed seeing is that so many of you were really surprised at how favourably she was reviewed. She had a modest but respectable reputation in her own lifetime. She was being read, she was being appreciated. And, you know, Walter Scott's review of Emma is that's a marker in literary history. This is the best novelist of the age. Arguably, who's the best novelist? So the best novelist of the age, perhaps Austen, being read by what contemporaries thought was the best novelist of the age, Walter Scott. And his review in the Quarterly is a really sustained engagement of Austen's fiction and her narrative style. Do read it. We've given you the link to it on the British Library website. If you haven't looked at Walter Scott and Emma, please do so. I mean, I think this whole question of what contemporary reviews were for and what they were doing is a very interesting and important one. Lots of you picked up that these reviews were really long and that they gave the plot away, and that can seem very surprising. There are very clear marketing reasons for that. Fiction's expensive. A triple-decker novel in the period is costing a large proportion of the ordinary working person's wage. They're not buying novels, they're borrowing them from the circulating library. So what the reviews are doing is providing a sort of marker of what you could read, what you should read. And in fact, the reviews themselves are not ephemeral publications. You don't pick one up and then throw it out the following week. This kind of thing is bound, it stays on your shelves, and it can be read years and years later. There are some concrete examples of that. Maria Edgeworth is reading reviews that were published years and years ago in the 1820s. So I think this engagement with what we think of now as ephemeral printed material is quite different in the Regency period.
So it becomes a way of kind of curating taste, I suppose.
Absolutely. And I think this question of Austen not being known in her own lifetime and her posthumous reputation really being what made her, well, that's absolutely true, of course. And it's throughout the 19th century that her popularity grows. We've been doing a lot of discussing about the first biographies and Henry Austen's first biographical notice of his sister, again published anonymously, but scholars are certain that it was Henry who wrote it. He might have had input from his siblings and indeed from his mother, but the pen was his. And it's an obituary, isn't it? And it presents her as a respectable woman, God-fearing woman, loved canonical English literature. But when we investigate her, we know that that's not quite the whole story.
I mean, I think this also gets picked up on by, there's been a lot of discussion of Charlotte Bronte's assessment.
Yes, absolutely.
And how Charlotte Bronte kind of creates an Austen that we're kind of we're still familiar with in some ways, I think. And that opposition between Austen's very kind of polite walled garden fiction and Charlotte Bronte's sort of rampaging around on the moors,
throbbing passions.
Yeah. So
it's all about the throbbing.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
And there's quite interesting scholarship, I think, going on today to try and kind of resituate the body in Jane Austen. So John Wiltshire's done really interesting work, I think, on on the fact that there are bodies in Austen, but they sort of ache and fall apart rather than throb with passion. Okay, so I think we should probably move on to the third myth.
So myth 3, Kim. Jane Austen was a poor spinster. Now, anyone who did the course in the first incarnation a few months ago will know that we've added a lot of material into week 2. Alison and Amy, who you've been seeing on the boards and you saw do the roundup last week, have introduced some brilliant stuff on money and on celebrity in the period. Jane Austen was a poor spinster, was she?
Well, I mean, I think we should start off by saying that poverty is relative, and actually Austen, she's not badly off, you know, she gets by, I think, But I think a lot of people have pointed out on the boards that she isn't actually writing about the working classes. People have mentioned the spin-off Longbourn, I think, as an example of a kind of engagement with Austen after the fact. But actually, Austen is writing for her own class, and she's writing about a particular kind of class of people. So whilst her life didn't kind of match the majority of Britons at the time, I think she is kind of recreating a very specific kind of a very specific moment and a very specific set of concerns that are faced by middle class women at the time. So concerns about primogeniture, concerns about the entailing of estates, which kind of prompts so much of the action in some of her novels, and also this idea of what happens when one becomes a wife as well to one's property. I think is something that Austen would have kind of dealt with on a in her social circle at the time.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, so I think to kind of point out that she was a poor spinster but wasn't writing about the working classes is sort of slightly inaccurate, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is very interesting that this preoccupation with, I suppose what we call upstairs, downstairs, has been very much a turn of 20th century history and historiography and historians looking at the unwashed masses, and a preoccupation in adaptation too. So novels like Joe Baker's Longbourn that retells Pride and Prejudice from the point of view of the servants. I saw a wonderful adaptation in Glasgow very recently, Pride and Prejudice sort of, which has musical elements and involved the 5 actresses playing the 5 Bennet sisters, but also the maids. And I think we want to know about these lives, below stairs. It's why Downton Abbey was so popular.
Absolutely.
But worth pointing out that in the late 18th and early 19th century, with very odd exceptions, Pamela is perhaps the obvious one, but the novel is not treating this class of people. There are very, very few novels that look at the lives of the working classes. That comes much later. So kind of projecting our interest on those figures and what Austen could have been doing and should have been doing is somewhat anachronistic.
Yes, although I think, it's interesting because there is that discussion around adaptation about the silences in the novels and these very productive kind of openings that what's left unsaid in Austen's novels then provides a very kind of rich canvas for people to subsequently sort of do a bit of digging. One of the other people I'd sort of think we could flag there is Amanda Vickery, who I think's done a lot of work on the kind of upstairs, downstairs.
Yes, absolutely. And if people haven't read Vickery's The Gentleman's Daughter, you absolutely should. It's a wonderful work that looks at real women's lives in this period. So that's another recommendation for you. I mean, I think I always like to look at reception. So what were contemporaries thinking about Jane Austen's writing? And one woman writer, much more famous in Austen's own age than Austen was herself, was Germaine de Staël, the Franco-Swiss writer. She apparently read Pride and Prejudice, and she had one word to say about it, which was vulgaire. Now, the translation of that is not exactly vulgar. It wouldn't be exactly that. It's more like mundane, commonplace. Germaine de Staël looked at Austen's characters and thought they're not aristocratic enough. So it's all about perspective, isn't it? And about expectation and about what we think the novel could and should be doing. And the Regency period haven't quite established that yet.
Is there something in that about Austen talking too much about money as well?
Absolutely, quite right. And I think again, this sort of the sense of shock that a reader would have had reading that Bingley is here and his wealth is nothing to Mr. Darcy and he has £10,000 a year. That's very shocking for fiction to be dealing in that way with, W.H. Auden put it brilliantly, didn't he? The amorous effects of brass. And it does shock, I think. And I think sometimes when we read it very carefully, it still shocks.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's move on to myth number 4. this is the idea that Jane Austen is England's Jane. So I wonder if you could speak a bit about that. Is she England's Jane?
Well, that's one of the main things I think we wanted to tackle in this course. If you have not yet had a look at the map of participants since you put your own marker on it in week 1, do have a look. We've got participants in this course from every continent. It's really quite remarkable, the spread of Jane. So she's gone from an English novelist to really a global phenomenon.
Yes,
and that's something we wanted to interrogate and investigate. And we wanted to do that through translation and through the first translations, because I think what I've really enjoyed seeing, because this is my own area of research, I've really enjoyed seeing how surprised people are that Jane Austen was translated within her own lifetime. And she's making her way across the Channel to France. She's hitting the Paris bookshelves. She's also hitting the Philadelphia bookshelves. She's her Emma is published in 1816 by a Philadelphia bookseller called Carey. So this is already a global spread for her fiction. And what I wanted us to think about a little bit is how much in the contemporary period, in her own lifetime and immediately after, was this to do with her being recognised as a great writer. And in fact, my answer to that, my 3-word answer is not at all. I don't think that she was being translated into French because people recognised her genius. I think there was a cross-channel vogue for fiction, and that Isabelle de Montalieu picked that up and really ran with it.
But actually did something quite different with some of took some serious liberties.
Yes.
So there's also been a lot of interest in how translation is not what we would currently think of as translation.
Exactly.
These questions around kind of fidelity and those sorts of things.
And I think that's been the wonderful thing about this course is one never knows who quite is going to be joining us on the board. And we've been really lucky in this section of the course because we've got practicing translators commenting. We've got excellent comments about what translation now is supposed to be doing, about what an ideal translation could and should be, about is there a perfect translation. And I think the response to that is, well, no, there isn't. But Isabelle Montalieu changed the ending of Sense and Sensibility, and that is by no means an expected thing to be doing, and it's very shocking what she does to it, actually. I mean, the sort of resolution to the Willoughby Marianne story is very surprising indeed. But what I've always liked about it, and I said this in my conversation with Isabelle Bourg at the Sorbonne, was I've always felt that Isabelle de Montalieu is doing what filmmakers do. You know, she's working with a story. She's redesigning it for the horizon of expectation of her readers. She knows who they are, and she knows what they want from the novel. And we mustn't forget that in the early 19th century, when Isabelle de Montalieu is doing her translations, so she translates Sense and Sensibility, she also translates Persuasion into La Famille Eliot, the Eliot family. And what she's doing there is she's making her own creative original. And she's the big name. She's the brand. An Isabelle de Montalieu novel is a novel that will sell. And it was via her translations that Jane Austen made her way into Russia, into Sweden. You know, she's the name that's carrying throughout the bulk of the 19th century. So, yeah, we really wanted to think about global reception. We wanted to think about translation. And we've been absolutely thrilled that so many of you who first came to Austen via translations have been pitching in to that conversation.
I think, the same can be said for adaptation as well. So there's been a lot of kind of conversation about this tension between something that's true to the original, between something that's kind of historically accurate, or something that's kind of Austen-esque. So the idea that there's a kind of core at the heart of Jane Austen. It's sometimes to do with dialogue or to do with characterisation, or those sorts of things. And then these kind of quite sort of creative rewritings of Austen's fiction, so ones that move Austen's fiction into the modern day, for example, things like Bridget Jones or Clueless and those sorts of things. But there's also been discussion about the way that adaptations can sometimes keep alive an original. And I think what you were saying about Isabelle de Montalieu becoming a kind of way in which Austen does get spread around, I suppose. Perhaps there's a sort of similar thing going on with those 90s adaptations of Austen's novels, which introduced Jane Austen's work to a lot of women, and kind of introduced Jane Austen as a feminist.
Absolutely, and a lot of women and global audiences too. I mean, it's worth pointing out something that's been pointed out on the boards, which is that it was via the 1990s adaptations that Austen was first translated into a great many languages. You know, she didn't have a textual presence in Catalan until the 1990s. I've just said that and realised that might not be true. Anyway, certainly a lot of Icelandic. No textual presence in Iceland before the 1990s. So a lot of work has been done on that kind of area. I've put some links on the board for those of you who are really interested, who want to follow it up. But let's bring this back to adaptation and bring it back to our final myth, which is that Colin Firth is the one true Mr. Darcy. This is just a joking way of talking a little bit more about adaptation and about what we expect from an adaptation.
I think there have been some really interesting discussions about the way that adaptations can sometimes open up, as we said, those productive silences in the text, but also sometimes shut down or shut out certain elements of Austen's work. So the satire, for example, there was a really interesting conversation about Austen as a kind of romance writer, and how she's been reframed as this writer who writes solely about, you know, girl meets boy and then they get married and they live happily ever after. And of course it's a lot more complicated in Austen's fiction, which is replete with kind of bad marriages outside of the kind of central couple. So I think there's this question around how Austen has been framed, partly by adaptations. We were thinking earlier on about those sort of chick lit covers as well, and how Austen's fiction is wrapped up in adaptations, but also even in the kind of packaging of the books themselves.
Well, absolutely, and that's why we thought it was a really good exercise for you to have a look at your own editions of Austen and say, you know, who is this being marketed to? Because when you have a canonical author like Jane Austen, Oxford University Press, Cambridge University Press, Harvard University Press are all producing editions. But so are publishers who want to sell their novels in airports and at in supermarkets, you know, cheap editions. And they're being marketed quite differently. You don't have the paratextual weight of scholarship that the scholarly editions have. And looking at book jackets can be very revealing. So there's one I particularly love, which is a French edition of Pride and Prejudice, which is bright pink and has a hand held up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 little ladies wearing veils. And so you wonder, well, is it poor Mary Bennett's been left out again? I mean, so many questions about that edition. So I think there's a lot of fun that you can have by picking up your own editions of Austen and saying, who's this for? Is it for me?
I think, I mean, there's also a sense that sometimes the adaptations do take over. So I do think a lot of people on the boards have said, Mr. Darcy is Colin Firth in a wet shirt. But also things about quotations as well, and a kind of proliferation of misquotations.
Absolutely. And we have fallen prey to this. So a very helpful participant from the last run of the course pointed out that the C.S. Lewis quotation we use in one of the exercises is not C.S. Lewis on Fanny Price at all. It's a quotation from the Screwtape Diaries that's about something else entirely. It is quite similar to what he did say about Fanny Price, but it's not the same. And yet that quotation has made it into the Longman Scholarly edition of Mansfield Park. So yes, we're not immune to this kind of thing ourselves. That mistake will be changed for the next run, but I thought it was fun to kind of let it stand for this one, because it's another one of the myths.
But it is interesting how these things get passed back and forth. And there's that quotation from Sense and Sensibility, which was in the one of the sculptures as well that we used.
That's right.
There are a lot of quotations on the internet sort of circulating. That
you
are
can buy them on
from
mugs. You can buy a mug saying something that was said in the film of Sense and Sensibility, but Jane Austen never wrote it in her life. I'm conscious of time here, Kim. We have probably delighted these good people quite long enough. And what's more important is that I am about to depart for a holiday. Little sea bathing will set me up nicely for the next run of this course, although we're not entirely sure when that will happen. So it just remains to say the boards will be open. Do continue discussing. There are some extremely knowledgeable people on the boards. There are also people, and these are the people we want to keep. If you've never read much Austen, if you're intimidated by the discussion, please don't be. We're all there to learn. We're learning things every day, and we hope you enjoy it. So thank you and goodbye.
Thank you very much.